One of the first differences you'll notice with these two cards is the difference between FSR 3 and FSR 4, and this video will have a lot of side-by-side footage, but notice some things like the difference in the cat face here. Look at the feathers here. You can pinch to zoom if you need to. Look at the texture detail. In general, and I could play this in motion, FSR 3 was something I would very much avoid using at lower resolutions like 1080p, even out its quality setting. I might use it at quality at a 4K output without too much hesitation, but it still wasn't perfect. Whereas FSR 4 looks great. I can use it at 1080p with no issues at the quality setting. 1440p balance looks good. 4K, even in the performance mode, looks quite good, very usable. Whereas here you can see that in motion again, FSR 3 breaks up. There's a lot of disocclusion artifacting, a lot of loss of detail. So that's one of the biggest differences I think you'll notice between these two cards. Another one, though, is ray tracing performance, because I'll tell you that on average, when you're not using ray tracing, the 9060 XT isn't going to be 50% faster than the 6700 XT. But when you are using ray tracing, well, that's a whole other story, and we'll need to investigate these things. But also, these cards don't cost the same, so you might be looking at this video in two ways. One is, you might already have a 6700 XT. The one I'm investigating in this video, by the way, is the AMD reference model. So if you have a 6700 XT, there's a good chance you'd be getting better temperatures, for example, because notice that here, this one does tend to run a bit hot, and you might also get better boost clocks out of the box. But that's the 6700 XT we're testing here. Now, AMD's 9060 series doesn't have, their 9000 series in general doesn't have an AMD reference model. So what I got here is the ASUS Prime. So this is a higher end cooler. So do keep that in mind when you're judging things like temperatures and such. Shouldn't affect our overall performance numbers too greatly, other than a few percent for the factory overclock here, but nothing too extreme. I'm running them both at their out-of-the-box settings and not trying to manually overclock. So somebody might have a 6700 XT and be wondering, is it worth upgrading to the 9060 XT? And another thought, though, could be if somebody's just looking to buy a graphics card and is considering buying a used 6700 XT to get more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM at a reasonable price, or would it be worth spending a bit more on the 9060 XT? Which means before we go any further with this video, we should probably talk about pricing. Well, 9060 XTs can come in at $300. That's the 8 gigabyte version, and I do not recommend buying a new 8 gigabyte graphics card for $300 plus in 2025. I've got other videos talking more about that. The 16 gigabyte version is meant to have a $350 MSRP, but those are generally out of stock at this time. I am seeing them in stock as low as $370 though, and then they do go up from there. But what about the 6700 XT? Well, these are kind of out of stock new. Anything that's in stock new is at stupid pricing, so that's really not the way you would be considering buying one of these. Now, they used to be in stock new for kind of in that $350 and less, so oftentimes you could get deals for $330 or even as low as $300 on occasional little flash sales and things like that. So really the 9060 XT is entering the market at a similar price to where the 6700 XT has sat for quite a while, for a number of years now. But what about the used market, which is where you'd be looking if you were actually considering buying a 6700 XT today? Well, if I do like an average price tracker thing for eBay, it spits out about $270 for the rolling 2-week average. And that the 90-day average is around $280. Now, I think the last 2 weeks makes the most sense here because cards like the 9060 XT entering the new market should have the effect of pushing down similarly priced used cards that aren't quite as good. So there is that. So if we looked at this from a price percentage differential, you could think of this as about $100 in an absolute price difference. If you're going to buy the 9060 XT, you'd be spending about $100 more. Or as a percentage differential, it's about 37% more money to get the 9060 XT. So is it worth it? Well, like I said, Huge difference in the upscaler quality, but that's not going to show up in bar graphs. But we will also have bar graphs. We will have percentage differential graphs. We will break it down by ray tracing, no ray tracing, 1080p, 1440p, as well as upscaled, not upscaled, maximum settings, medium settings. And that is what we will be testing in this video. But I do want to start with the side-by-sides where we can talk about some of the less tangible differences that at least in a bar graph format, but that do absolutely affect your real world experience with the card. So first we're gonna do a bunch of side-by-side footage, then we'll get into a bunch of bar graphs and value analysis. So what am I even testing in this video? We are testing the newest games, so games released in 2025. Not necessarily because you're going to play these particular games, although you might, but because testing the newest games is the best way to tell what things will be like over the next few years. Generally, games get more demanding over time, so this is really a best case scenario. Things will probably get more demanding as time goes on. I'll be testing native 1080p and native 1440p, but also the way you might actually play it, which would be upscaled 1080p and upscaled 1440p. I'll do both. I'll also test out max settings, which often includes ray tracing in the latest games, and then I'll also include medium settings, which often will not include ray tracing, but some games like Doom the Dark Ages, for example, and there's others, never turns ray tracing all the way off. Let's start with the biggest game released so far in 2025. This is Monster Hunter Wilds, and at 1080p max settings, which is ultra with RT set to high, the 9060 XT is cruising right along at 57 FPS versus 39 on the 6700 XT. It's a 46% advantage for the newer card, and one of them is extremely playable, and the other one is sort of playable. Right? Anyway, let's go ahead and kick on upscaling though. So again, look at the image quality differences. It's a lot blurrier, a lot more fizzle, disocclusion pop, loss of detail on the left-hand side of the screen, whereas the right-hand side of the screen, I'm saying looks just about as good as our native 1080p results did. So that gets the 9060 XT up to 66 FPS, which is 50% faster than the 6700 XT at 44. So not only is it a 50% faster, but it's also looking better while doing it. It's the difference between I would probably use FSR 4 here, whereas FSR 3, I would be scrambling to turn down graphic settings rather than use the upscaler at 1080p. But let's go ahead and move on to what if you just went to medium settings and you turned off ray tracing? Well, now notice that the lead drops to 34%, and that's a much more typical result for when we're not using ray tracing. So there was a huge change with the 90 series from AMD with its ray tracing performance. It was a massive improvement. And that's why we're seeing when we turn ray tracing off, the 9060's XT's lead decreases, although it still has a noticeable lead here by 34% at 71 FPS versus 53. Now, notice we can turn on FSR 3 or FSR 4 at the quality settings here as well. And the 9060 XT is 31% faster here. It's 84 versus 64 FPS, so both are very playable. But the 9060 XT is noticeably faster, but once again, when you look at the fine details here, one of them's a lot blurrier than the other, meaning I would actually be very willing to play at these settings on the 9060 XT, whereas with the 6700 XT, I probably would have left it at medium settings with native resolution. So the difference in your actual usage experience is going to be larger than what the percentage difference tells you here, I think. Now, what about 1440p? Well, max settings, ultra with RT high at native 1440p, this is a bit too difficult for both GPUs. It's 43 FPS versus 30, so the 9060 XT, I mean, could be playable here on a controller if you like that 40 FPS kind of experience, and it is 43% faster than the 6700 XT, but I think I'd probably turn things down. Now, on the 9060 XT, I'd be very happy to kick FSR 4 balanced mode on. Still maintains a lot of the detail of native resolution. I find this extremely usable. Whereas on the left-hand side of the screen, especially in motion, you'll notice the characters break up and fizzle quite a bit, and there's a lot of loss of detail. So while the 9060 XT here is only 33% faster at 56 versus 42, it is, I would say, a noticeably better looking experience. And so, in other words, the 56 FPS here we're getting on the 9060 XT, I would say is not only very usable from a frame rate standpoint, but from an image quality standpoint. Whereas the 6700 XT, I probably wouldn't want to be using FSR balanced mode unless I really, really had to with FSR 3. Now, at 1440p medium settings, we're getting 54 FPS at native resolution on the 9060 XT and 40 FPS at native resolution on the 6700 XT. 35% lead for the 9060 XT. And again, one is a lot more playable than the other, although 40 FPS is, I think, doable in a lot of games if you know, personal preferences will vary here. I think playing on my Steam Deck has got me very accustomed to 40 FPS modes. Anyway, 1440p medium, FSR 3, FSR 4 at balanced. Now the 9060 XT is good for 70 FPS. The 6700 XT is very playable at 55, and it's a 27% performance lead for the for the 9060 XT. But again, looking at the details as there's motion, things like the grass, look how much breakup there is on the characters, all of that. Again, it's most visible in motion, but if you do freeze it, like you can see very big differences on the like disocclusion fizzle on the edge of things, all of that. It's just a much more cohesive image on the right-hand side of the screen. I can't stress enough how big of a deal FSR 4 is compared to FSR 3. Now, let's move on to another big game from 2025 with Oblivion Remastered. At maximum settings, which do include hardware-based ray-traced lumen at its maximum setting, we're seeing even the 9060 XT is only good for 45 FPS here, which is certainly a lot more playable than the 6700 XT's 30 FPS, and it is 50% faster, but still probably not the way I'd play it. However, once again, we have FSR 3 and FSR 4 available, and FSR 4 looks much better than FSR 3. Now getting 58 FPS versus 40, so we're at around 60 FPS now on the 9060 XT. It's 45% faster, and image quality-wise, I would say is very usable, and a lot better than what we're seeing on FSR 3. But what if we just drop to medium settings and turn off the hardware-based RT lumen, and even turn the software lumen down to low? Now we're seeing the 9060 XT hit 91 FPS, but the 6700 XT is at 74, which is, so the 9060 XT is only 23% faster here. It is noticeably faster, but not a mind-blowing upgrade if you like already had a 6700 XT or something like that. Now we could kick on FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the quality setting, and if you look at the tree branches and the grass, you're getting a lot of fizzle and flicker on the left-hand side of the screen, and a much more cohesive image on the right-hand side of the screen. It's 114 FPS versus 96, so it's a 19% performance lead for the 9060 XT, but a bigger lead if you factored in the image quality. At 1440p max settings, we're seeing 32 FPS versus 20, so while it is a 60% lead for the 9060 XT, potentially going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM here, if you look at the allocation at least, is not super usable settings on either GPU. Even kicking FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the balanced mode only gets the 9060 XT up to 47 FPS, which is playable, but I'd probably still turn some things down, versus 31 FPS on the 6700 XT, which isn't great frame rate or image quality due to the FSR 3 upscale. Now, what about medium settings at 1440p? Well, now we're getting 59 FPS versus 50, so both are very playable. It is 18% faster on the 9060 XT, though. If we kick on FSR 3 and FSR 4 balanced, we're getting 91 FPS versus 80, 14% performance lead for the 9060 XT, but also an image quality advantage as well. What if we moved on to Marvel's Spider-Man 2? Max settings do include RT at the ultimate setting, and here we're getting 57 FPS on the 9060 XT. It's perfectly playable. Whereas the 6700 XT is getting crushed at 24. What's going on here? More than 12 gigabytes of VRAM. The 9060 XT is reporting 15 gigabytes of allocation and 13 gigabytes of per process usage. So this is a game that absolutely goes over 12 gigabytes of VRAM at its max settings at even 1080p resolution, and is very playable on the card with enough VRAM. Using FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the quality setting, this is a game where FSR 3 looks bad. Look at the water, how pixelated it is on the hoses there. Look at Spider-Man's left arm in motion. This looks very bad with FSR 3. FSR 4, though, looks great. And 78 FPS on the 9060 XT here because you have a good upscaler and you have enough VRAM. The 6700 XT is down at 33 FPS though, so huge lead for the 9060 XT, and it is at a very playable setting for the 9060 XT, again, because of enough VRAM and a good upscaler. Now, we don't have to play at max settings though. If we go down to medium at native resolution, it's 119 FPS versus 80. It's still a 49% lead here for the 9060 XT, so it is a big advantage. But both cards are very, very usable here. And if you kick on FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the quality setting, it's now 153 FPS versus 101, 51% lead for the 9060 XT, and a big image quality lead. I probably wouldn't use the quality level upscaler here on the 6700 XT, but using it on the 9060 XT here, perfectly reasonable. 1440p max settings, even the 9060 XT is struggling and even showing some signs of going a little bit over VRAM usage even on 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and we're at 39 FPS versus 15. But not particularly great experience on either GPU. Kicking on FSR 3 and FSR 4 balanced, the 9060 XT is now much more playable at 54 FPS versus 24 on the 6700 XT. Also, the image quality is much better on the 9060 XT with the upscaler. I mean, look at the differences on Spiderman's left arm in motion. Just massive improvements with FSR 4. 1440p medium settings are 82 FPS versus 56. It's a 46% lead for the 9060 XT, but definitely still playable on the 6700 XT, although not averaging 60 FPS. Kicking on FSR 3 and FSR 4 in the balanced mode gets us to 119 FPS versus 84, 42% lead for the newer card. And significantly better image quality. Again, just look at Spider-Man's left arm. I think that's all you need to see. And you can tell the differences on that upscaling result there. It is a big difference. So again, very glad AMD improved the upscaling with the new generation. Now, Assassin's Creed Shadows, we're at 1080p max settings, which do include ray tracing. It's 39 FPS versus 30, so not great on either GPU, but it is a 30% lead for the 9060 XT, and it is near a 40 FPS average, which again, on a controller, is a sacrifice some people would be willing to make for maximum settings. However, we could, of course, turn on FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the quality setting, where now the 9060 XT is good for 47 FPS. It's still a bit low, but the image quality still looks quite good with FSR 4 at the quality setting. So while it's a 31% advantage in performance, that gets you a much more playable experience from both a frame rate and image quality perspective. So anyway, there is that. Now, at 1080p medium settings, with RT turned down as low as possible, which is hideout only, so I think it's off here for the because I don't think this benchmark is going through the hideout area, we're now looking at 83 FPS versus 66. It's a 26% advantage for the 9060 XT. If we turn on FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the quality setting, we're now at 92 FPS versus 79. So it's a 16% performance advantage for the 9060 XT, but the image quality advantage should not be ignored either. Now, let's go to 1440p max settings, where it's now 31 FPS versus 22. It's grown to a 41% lead for the 9060 XT, potentially due to VRAM allocation slightly above 12 gigabytes. It's right on the borderline there, though. Could also just be the ray tracing win for the newer generation. But honestly, not the settings I'm going to use even on the 9060 XT. I know consoles will often shoot for a 30 FPS, max settings mode, but probably not the way most PC users would want to do it. If we go to FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the balanced mode, though, at max settings with the 1440p output, the 9060 XT would at least be getting you to a 40-ish FPS mode, averaging 42 FPS here, which is 35% faster than the 6700 XT, which is averaging 31. If we go ahead and go to 1440p medium settings, though, at native resolution, and again, RT is effectively off for this test, we're at 67 FPS on the 9060 XT, which is noticeably more performant than the 6700 XT, which is at 53 FPS, which is still quite usable, though. It's a 26% advantage for the 9060 XT. Now, using FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the balance settings gets us to 81 FPS, versus 72. So now both are extremely playable performance-wise, but look at the pink petals in the background. Look at the tree branches in the background. Just look at any of the texture detail, any of it. it's all just so much more noticeably sharp on the right-hand side of the screen. So again, well, it's only a 13% performance advantage here. One of them, I would be very happy to use this level of upscaling, and the other one, I would be trying to avoid it. So that does need to be factored in here. Now, Doom the Dark Ages requires ray tracing. At its maximum settings, which currently there is no path tracing mode, although it has been announced to be coming out at some point. Currently, this is just a normal ray tracing, but at the Ultra Nightmare settings. The 9060 XT is good for 74 FPS, whereas the 6700 XT is good for only 50 FPS. It's a 48% lead for the newer card, and again, that's due to the improvements to ray tracing performance made on the newer generation. Now, using FSR at the quality setting, I have a bit of a problem. FSR 4 is not available in this game, and this game runs on Vulkan, and I believe that FSR 4 has not fully been ported to Vulkan yet at this time, I believe. That's the best research I could do on that. Anyway, with that being said, 101 FPS versus 71, it is an apples-to-apples comparison. It's a 42% lead for the 9060 XT, but again, unfortunate FSR 4 was not available here. Doom the Dark Ages at 1080p medium settings is still using ray tracing, and now we're getting 86 FPS versus 58. So the 6700 XT is very close to 60 FPS now. The 9060 XT at a nice high refresh rate experience. Now, we could use FSR 3 quality to get 122 versus, let me go back for a second, sorry. So 1080p medium, but with FSR 3 quality, we're at 122 FPS versus 85. 44% lead for the 9060 XT, but again, I would be avoiding using upscaling here if possible, just due to the FSR 4 not being available. 1440p max is 52 FPS versus 34, 53% lead for the 9060 XT, and a lot closer to a good experience without upscaling. If we do kick on FSR 3 at the balance setting, it's 82 FPS versus 57, so performance numbers are good now, and 44% lead for the newer card, but it's a little aggressive for FSR 3 on the upscaling settings here. 1440p medium, we're at 59 FPS versus 39, so 51% lead for the newer card and close to 60 FPS without needing to rely on any upscaling here due to the increased ray tracing performance on the new generation. And if we do use medium settings with FSR 3 balanced, it's 97 FPS versus 69. Well, 69 is nice, 97 is 41% faster. But again, a little aggressive on the upscaling given that it's FSR 3 in my opinion. Now, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 at 1080p max settings does not run well on either GPU. It's 28 versus 23. The new one is 22% faster, but I would not use these settings. Using FSR 3 and FSR 4 barely improves performance to 24 and 29, 21% lead for the 9060 XT, and an image quality lead. Again, look at how shimmery the branches are on the left-hand side if you look at when it's up against the sky. But still not the settings you would actually use. If we drop to 1080p medium, we're at 119 FPS versus 98, 21% lead for the 9060 XT, and you could turn on FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the quality setting. Look at the branches when they're up against the sky on the left-hand side of the screen, and look how shimmery they are versus how cohesive and stable they are on the right-hand side of the screen. There's other differences as well, but that's to me the most noticeable one here. So 141 FPS versus 121, but I probably wouldn't use FSR 3 quality, but I probably would, or at least could very usably use FSR 4 at the quality setting here. 17% performance lead, but big image quality lead for the 9060 XT. 1440p max settings are not very usable at 24 FPS versus 20, although it is 20% faster on the 9060 XT. And using FSR 3 and FSR 4 at the balanced mode only gets things up to 27 and 23 FPS. 17% lead for the 9060 XT, big image quality lead, but not settings you would use on either card. 1440p medium settings, though, run at 81 and 70, 16% lead for the newer card, and very good experience on both. And using FSR 3 and FSR 4 balanced, again, look at the tree leaves up against the sky. You can see a huge difference. It's much better on FSR 4. So while it's only a 9% performance advantage for the 9060 XT, it is a big advantage in image quality. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 at its maximum settings is 52 FPS versus 42, 24% lead for the 9060 XT, and probably not the settings I would use on either GPU, although, guys, I absolutely love this game, so every video I make testing it out, I'm going to remind you that if you have any interest at all in turn-based RPGs, this is a great one. Or just honestly games with a really good story. And even if you don't usually like turn-based RPGs, you might like this one because there's a lot of reactive like parrying and dodging and things like that, despite it being turn-based. Anyway, if we kick on upscaling, well, there's no FSR in this game at all, let alone FSR 4. So I'm using XeSS here at its 67% internal rendering resolution, which is effectively the quality setting for FSR and DLSS, but XeSS names it differently. We're now hitting 72 FPS and 58 FPS, so 24% lead for the 9060 XT, and the same image quality on both, considering it's the same upscaler. Dropping to medium settings with no upscaling, though, gets us to 84 and 68 FPS, so good experience now on both at native 1080p, 24% faster on the 9060 XT. And using XeSS at the 67% per axis scaling, we're at 104 versus 86, 21% lead for the 9060 XT, though. This is a game where I'd probably stay at the native resolution, though, and just use medium on both GPUs. 1440p max settings are only running at 35 and 28 FPS respectively, 25% lead for the 9060 XT, but not the settings I'd use on either one, and using XeSS at the 58% per axis scale, which is what DLSS and FSR would name balanced, but XeSS names otherwise. It's 60 FPS now on the 9060 XT, but only 48 on the 6700 XT. Using medium settings at native resolution gets us to 58 and 49 respectively, 18% lead for the newer card, and using XeSS at 58% per axis, 88 FPS versus 73, 21% lead for the 9060 XT. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth uses the older Unreal Engine 4, and at 1080p max settings, we're seeing 75 FPS versus 65, so both are perfectly good here. 15% lead on the newer card. And if you want to upscale, you're stuck with TAAU, so I honestly just wouldn't use this. It does not look good at all. It's 88 FPS versus 74 FPS, though, 19% lead for the 9060 XT. But again, if you look at anything in motion, it's very, very pixelated. The distant objects, the grass, everything, it just looks bad. I'd stick to native here. 1080p medium is 87 FPS versus 77, 13% lead for the 9060 XT. And I didn't use upscaling at medium there because we'd hit the frame rate cap and it just looks bad. 1440p max settings, it's 59 FPS versus 52, 13% lead for the newer card, and it is getting it much closer to a 60 FPS average. Using upscaling with TAAU gets it to 76 and 65 respectively, 17% lead for the newer card, but again, I just really do not like how this looks for the upscaling in TAAU. Now, 1440p medium settings, though, do get us over 60 FPS on both cards at native resolution at 69, which is 13% nicer than 61. TAAU gets us to 91 FPS and 78, 17% lead for the newer card, but once again, we're getting a lot of disocclusion fizzling as Cloud moves. Look at his left arm, people moving in the distance, distant objects. It just doesn't look great. All right, that is all of the tests that I ran, and that was quite a lot of tests. Here's what it looks like if you just want, here's the average FPS in each of the tests that I ran, all stuck together. So that's a lot to look at. If I scroll down, you can actually read the names of the tests. Here we're looking at the 9060 XT in blue and the 6700 XT in red. So you can see that the blue line is always above the red line, although the amount varies depending on the exact settings that we're using. And I deem, because honestly, I think 60 FPS is sort of a holdover from monitors running at 60 FPS and needing VSync rather than variable refresh rate. I personally deem 50 FPS as pretty playable in single-player games, although a lot of people will be like, I can't play anything less than 100 FPS. Okay, that's fine. We can all have differences of opinions. But the point is, I have a 50 FPS line here and a 100 FPS line here. And so you can see that the blue line is getting to 50 FPS or better a lot more often than the red line, but it's often, the red line can get there too. But there's also a lot of stuff way below that. So I really think we need to sort this data in some different ways. Another way we can look at this, though, is in percentage advantages, right? So this graph was showing us average FPS. This graph is showing us the percentage advantage. Now, the 9060 XT did win in every test, so the numbers you're seeing here isn't a frame rate number, it's what percent faster was the 9060 XT in each test. And it also gives us the geomean of the results. On average, the 9060 XT is 35% faster than the 6700 XT. But when you look at this, you can really get a better feel for what's going on. It's sometimes only in the teens or 20% faster range, but often is 40 or 50% faster. But a lot of that has to do with whether ray tracing is being used. Also, what's up with these? Well, that is what happens when you go over 12 gigabytes of VRAM. So this is the only test where I'm pretty confident. The issue is that 12 gigabytes of VRAM was not enough for those settings. But if we go back to the frame rate numbers there, it's actually very usable on the 9060 XT. So it's not just that well, it's at stupid settings anyway. No, it's at settings that were completely usable on the 9060 XT, especially when you used upscaling, which having FSR 4 available is much more usable. So the 9060 XT averages 35% faster, but there's a lot more nuance going on here than that number might imply on its own. So let's break this down, first of all, as ray tracing versus not ray tracing. So this is just the ray tracing tests. And one thing that's pretty worth noting, I would say, is that most games released in 2025 had ray tracing available. And the 9060 XT could often run it pretty well, at least if you're using upscaling, but FSR 4 upscaling can look pretty good. So we can see that a lot of the blue line results are above 50 FPS and sometimes quite a bit above 50 FPS here. So that's one thing to look at here, whereas it's rare for the red line to be at or above 50 FPS. So that's important to note. Also, we can look at this as the percentage difference. So notice that now the smallest lead with ray tracing enabled for the 9060 XT is 30%, and some are well over 100% when we go over 12 gigabytes of VRAM usage, which did happen in Spiderman. But also results of 40% or more aren't uncommon. The geomean of these results is that the 9060 XT is 57% faster than the 6700 XT when we're averaging all of the ray tracing tests. But we could also look at the flip side of this. How much does the 9060 XT's lead drop if we don't include any ray tracing tests? So that's what we're going to look at next. This is the average FPS in all of our tests that did not include ray tracing. Notice that Doom the Dark Ages is now completely missing because it does not have a ray tracing off mode. So if you're just thinking, well, I don't care, I'm never going to use ray tracing, just keep in mind that there are multiple games out now that only have ray tracing modes. There's no RT off mode. And while that's still not super common, I think it will become more common because when you listen to game developers talk about this, they generally talk about how much easier it is to develop the game if you develop it with everybody's using ray tracing in mind. So whatever your opinions are on ray tracing, game developers like it. So I think we'll continue to see more and more of it. Anyway, but this is all the ray tracing off stuff. So no ray tracing here. You can see now that the red line is very often at or above 50 FPS, and the blue line is too, and by even more. But the bigger differences, well, I mean, the differences are smaller here. Anyway, so what if we go ahead and jump into the percentage differentials? So this is the no ray tracing involved percentage differences. And we can see here that with no ray tracing involved, there are still some big wins, but the bigger wins are like 50%-ish. And there's some very small wins, 9%, 13%, etc. The average now drops to 23%. So the 9060 XT is only showing an average of 23% faster than the 6700 XT if you're not including any ray tracing results. Although do keep in mind that in individual games, sometimes the performance lead is much more than that or less than that. But also keep in mind the upscaling differences because FSR 4 is so much more usable that I think it's effectively going to be a performance advantage for you where you would be willing to use it in cases where you wouldn't on the 6700 XT with FSR 3. And that's important to keep in mind when looking at this. But now let's break this down by monitor resolution. So what if you're on a 1080p display? Well, on a 1080p display, you might play at native resolution, or you might use quality level upscaling, and this shows both, okay? So this is all of my 1080p results at both native 1080p and upscaled 1080p. But do keep in mind that this is where if I'm using upscaling, the 9060 XT is providing much better image quality than the 6700 XT. This is why I include side-by-side footage, and if you're skipping to the graphs, you are missing a huge part of this review. Anyway, but now we can see that there's oftentimes places where the blue line is well above 50 FPS, whereas the red line's well below it, so something to keep in mind. Anyway, but what about the separating for graphics settings? So now instead of sorting for ray tracing on versus ray tracing off, what I'm actually gonna do is more of what I think is fair, because ray tracing is just a graphic setting. Oftentimes you can turn it off, but not always. So what I'm gonna do now is sort by maximum settings, which often include ray tracing, but not always, and medium settings, which often include ray tracing, but not always. But before we do that, let's get the average percentage difference for 1080p. So in all of the 1080p native and upscaled results, the 9060 XT is averaging 35% faster, but we can see there's a wide amount of variance here. So let's sort down to max settings only. So if we sort for max settings only at both native and upscaled, but you're using a 1080p display, so that's your output resolution, the 9060 XT is now 43% faster on average. Notice that a lot, but not all, of the max settings results here do include ray tracing. If we look at the average FPS, we can now see, we can see the percentage difference, but how playable was it, right? So at max settings at 1080p output, whether that's native or upscaled, we can see that the blue line is very frequently at or above the 50 FPS mark, whereas the red line is very frequently below 50 FPS. Although in Clair Obscur, when upscaled, or in Doom the Dark Ages, sometimes upscaling, but even getting about 50 FPS without upscaling, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So in some of the lighter games, the 6700 XT can play max settings 50 FPS, sometimes needing upscaling, sometimes not. Whereas the blue line, the 9060 XT, does not always need upscaling to be over 50 FPS at max settings at 1080p. And when using upscaling, frequently either gets there if it wasn't before, or is now even more noticeably above 50 FPS. But in games like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Assassin's Creed Shadows, the max settings are a bit too much for both GPUs, so you would want to turn some things down. Assassin's Creed Shadows doesn't look like it needs much turned down, at least if you're going to use quality level upscaling, which again with FSR 4 I think is pretty usable. But what if we switched over to medium results? And Darren, I'll have to call you back. Anyway, sorry, getting a phone call. 1080p medium settings look like this though. So at 1080p medium settings, again, you're noticing a native resolution result and an upscaled result for each game. We're seeing that the red line is pretty much always above 50 FPS. In fact, it always is above 50 FPS. So is the 6700 XT still usable in the newest games? Absolutely. On a 1080p display, even without upscaling, the 50 FPS line, the red bar is above it, and often well above it in every game. Doesn't even need upscaling to get there. So that's pretty good news for anybody who already has a 6700 XT or is considering buying one on a good deal used. The blue line, though, is often giving you a high refresh rate experience, and quite frequently even breaking 100 FPS, and using upscaling can often get you at least close to that. Anyway, so there's that. There's definitely a big frame rate difference here. But if we look at it on average, at 1080p medium settings, the 9060 XT is on average 28% faster than the 6700 XT. Notice that this does include ray tracing for Doom the Dark Ages, whereas the other games, all of them had ray tracing turned off for these medium settings. So not much ray tracing included here, it's just Doom the Dark Ages, which was one of the bigger leads though, 48%. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at 1440p now, though. So what if you're on a 1440p display? So 1440p display at either native resolution or an upscaled output to 1440p averages out to 34% faster on the 9060 XT. The average frame rates, though, if we go ahead and look at that, can be all over the place. Here, again, we have a 50 FPS line here, which again is what I deem as fairly playable in single player games. But again, you got a 75 and a 100 FPS line if that's more your speed. So if we look at this, what do we notice? Well, we notice that there's a lot of variance. So it's probably a good idea to once again break down for maximum settings versus medium settings. So if we look at the average FPS at 1440p maximum settings, it looks like this. Now, what do we notice? 50 FPS line, not a lot of results above that line, but blue gets more results there than red, and blue gets there sometimes with upscaling enabled, and that upscaling will look a lot better than when red is getting there through upscaling, right? So in general, 1440p max settings are a bit rough even for the 9060 XT. Although using upscaling, it can get there. Realistically though, a lot of its results that are falling short of 50 FPS are still well ahead of the red line, and so would take less tweaking of an optimization of graphic settings to get to a good frame rate than what you would need to do on the 6700 XT. Now, if we look at max settings average percentage differentials, the 9060 XT is averaging 44% faster. Keep in mind that many, but not all of these results do include ray tracing when we're using the maximum settings. But games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, Clair Obscur Expedition 33, those did not offer ray tracing, at least hardware-based ray tracing on their max settings. But what if we went to medium settings on a 1440p monitor? So medium settings on a 1440p display, at native resolution as well as upscaled results included as well. Here's what we see. Again, we've got the 50 FPS line. And now one thing that's good to see is that the blue line is, I think always, right? Yeah, I don't see a single result below 50 FPS for the blue line. The red line is occasionally below 50 FPS, often not by much, and then using upscaling always gets them both above the 50 FPS line. Although if you're relying on upscaling, the 9060 XT looks so much better, right? When FSR 4 is available. So that is something to keep in mind. But again, if you're looking at this, well, the 6700 XT is still very usable at 1440p if you're playing at reduced settings, sometimes having to upscale, which doesn't look great with the older upscaler though. So there's that. If we look at the percentage differential for the 9060 XT, it's a 25% average advantage at 1440p medium settings for the 9060 XT. Again, lower than the max settings, primarily due to max settings having more ray tracing involved, medium settings only having ray tracing for the Doom of the Dark Ages results. Okay, so what do we make of this, right? So I think, again, it was very helpful to have broken that out by settings and monitor resolution and all of that. So here's my overall take, and maybe I'll play this in the background while we do it. So my overall take is that, for one thing, the 9060 XT is a lot better at ray tracing than the 6700 XT, to the point where ray trace settings are very usable for the 9060 XT. And we're seeing that the newest games frequently offer ray tracing and are often designed with ray tracing in mind, some games not even allowing you to turn it off. So with that in mind, I think the 9060 XT is certainly a much more compatible for future games than the 6700 XT is. Also, again, upscalers are becoming a pretty big deal. Very frequently, games are, for better or worse, kind of relying on upscaling for their frame rate targets. And FSR 4 looks very noticeably better than FSR 3. And so when you're thinking about just the raw percentage performance differentials, I think you're missing something. Again, if you look at games like Spiderman, it's incredibly apparent how much better this upscaler looks. Like, look at Spider-Man's arm swinging in motion here. Look at it swinging in motion here. One of them is very distracting. The other one looks pretty good. Look at the water, all sorts of things. So that upscaler is another difference that you're paying for here. So the 9060 XT is a much more complete graphics card, offering the kinds of features that I think you would really want. And that's really good to see. That being said, if you already own a 6700 XT, I think it was important to note how frequently, you know, medium settings still work perfectly fine at 1080p, or even at 1440p medium settings still working pretty well. So in general, my final thoughts are, if you already have a 6700 XT, I'm not sure I would rush out an upgrade right now. If you're still happy with the performance you're getting in games, and you know, you're fine turning down settings to what you need to turn them down to make it work, I think the 6700 XT is still very usable. And so if you want to hang on to it for another generation to get even more bang for your buck when newer cards are out, even better than the 9060 XT at this price point, at least hopefully, right? Then I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. Now, if you're looking at buying one of these two cards though, yes, the 9060 XT is more expensive, but I do think it justifies it if it's within your budget range. Again, if we looked at the price difference of $100, you're getting a new GPU instead of a used one. So think about your warranty support, the longevity of driver support, all of that. You're spending 37% more money if you want to look at it that way. But again, in the average of all tests, it was 35% faster. Now, it's not 35% faster if you turn off ray tracing, but it's still faster even if you turn off ray tracing. And like I said, ray tracing is becoming more common and the 9060 XT can use it. Not only that, but because of the better upscaler, I would be so much more willing to use the upscaling or use it at a more aggressive setting that effectively becomes more performance, because I can run my game faster because I'm using more aggressive upscaling or using upscaling when I otherwise wouldn't. So I do think that that's, again, another thing that goes beyond just boil the review down to a percentage difference, right? So I do think that for all of those reasons, the 9060 XT, buying it new versus, you know, a used 6700 XT for around $270 is absolutely worth it if it's still in your price range. So that's, I think, the summary of the review. It was pretty long. Hopefully you found it useful and or interesting. And if you're interested in more detailed side-by-sides like this, lots of graphs, lots of footage, lots of detailed thoughts on the upgrade and or buying one over the other, I do this for all sorts of cards, so check the channel. I might have already done the one you're interested in, or stay tuned to the channel if you want. If I'm still, you know, I'll probably be producing it if I haven't made it yet, whatever comparison you're looking for. And let me know in the comment sections which ones you're looking for. Huge thank you to viewers, commenters, subscribers, and channel members who click the join button to help fund the channel. Producing this stuff takes a massive amount of time. So it's nice to get some of that compensation to make it all worthwhile beyond the satisfaction of a job well done. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day. Yeah, I'll just click the unrecord button or stop recording button. There we go. I'm rambling. Bye.